Hello, everybody. I'm using some new technology here. I hope it works well, but I know this isn't ideal. We'd rather be in the classroom, but this is the hand we've been dealt. So I'm going to try to talk to you guys today about the election of 1968, and it was a wild one. Going into 1968, you got to remember, President Lyndon B. Johnson had been president since the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, but in 1964, Johnson won an overwhelming electoral victory in the presidential election over Barry Goldwater. But by 1968, Johnson is basically going to be run out of Washington, D.C. because of his Vietnam War policy. In early 1968, the communist forces in Vietnam unleashed what became known as the Tet Offensive. It was a massive communist attack upon American and South Vietnamese soldiers throughout Vietnam. Now, eventually, after several months, it resulted in an American victory, but it proved that the Vietnam War was nowhere close to ending. So as more and more people started to protest the Vietnam War, Johnson became a casualty of his own Vietnam War policy. So Johnson announced on TV that he would not seek, nor would he accept, the nomination of his party for President of the United States of America. But Johnson had also faced primary challengers inside the Democrat Party primary, one of which, the main one, was Eugene McCarthy, not to be mistaken with Joseph McCarthy, who we talked about in the last section of notes. But Eugene McCarthy also helped convince Johnson that he didn't have a chance in re-election. So when Johnson drops out, this is opening the door for someone else who had thrown their hat in the ring, and that, of course, is the brother of John F. Kennedy, and that is Robert Francis Kennedy. He's back here on my wall, right there. You can see him from that Cuban Missile Crisis picture with his brother on the wall. But in 1968, Robert F. Kennedy starts racking up primary victories throughout the United States of America. But there's a great misconception about the 1968 Democrat primary campaign of Robert F. Kennedy. His victory was not a foregone conclusion. Robert F. Kennedy was not guaranteed the Democrat Party nomination because even though Johnson was not running for re-election, Lyndon Johnson still controlled the Democrat Party. But a tragic event will change the election of 1968 when Robert F. Kennedy is shot and killed at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California, following his California Democrat primary victory. See, on the night of June 5th, going into the morning of June 6th, Robert Kennedy was shot and killed by Sirhan Sirhan, which completely now is upending the election. So the Democrats go to Chicago. They have their convention. It is a nightmare. I mean, there are anti-war protesters outside. It is utter chaos. A riot breaks out outside. But eventually, the Democrats settle on Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who once had a Metrodome named after him in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But Hubert H. Humphrey emerges as the Democrat Party's nominee. On the Republican side, our old friend, Richard Milhous Nixon, is back. Remember Nixon? He was the vice president under Dwight David Eisenhower. He was also the 1960 Republican nominee and lost to John F. Kennedy. Nixon also ran for governor of California in the intervening time, and that did not go well. So 1968, spoiler alert, Nixon's going to win, ends up being one of the greatest political comebacks in American political history. Nixon, who was basically discarded by most people as a loser who could not win the presidency, is going to squeak out a narrow victory in 1968 over Hubert H. Humphrey. Now, how does Nixon do that? Nixon does it because he claims to be the candidate of law and order. Vote for me and I'll get those hippies off the street. Vote for me and I'll get us out of Vietnam. Nixon emerges as the candidate of Middle America. See, there's another great misconception about the 1960s. Not everybody was a hippie. We look back on it and we think that everybody was going to Woodstock, everybody was a hippie, and there were a lot of them. But the vast majority of Americans were what Nixon would go on to call the silent majority. And the silent majority were the people who went to work every day. They were the people who supported the war in Vietnam, even though its support was dwindling. So Nixon squeaks out this narrow victory with the support of the silent majority and with people like John Wayne. Yes, the actor John Wayne, Pilgrim. That's a terrible impersonation. But John Wayne supports Richard Nixon. So really, in 1968, who are you going to vote for? You going to vote for John Wayne and Richard Nixon? Or are you going to vote for the hippies? So that's really what it comes down to. And Nixon squeaks out a tiny little victory in 1968. Now, the thing about Richard Nixon is, Nixon has went down in history, and rightfully so, as our biggest political criminal. But Nixon actually will accomplish a few things worth admiring during his time in office. And we'll talk about that in future lectures. But one little side note about 1968, it was a rough year. I mean, we didn't just have the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. We didn't just have the anti-war protests going on throughout America. We didn't just lose Robert F. Kennedy. America also lost Dr. Martin Luther King. See, Dr. King, in the early morning of April 4th, 1968, was shot and killed. The night before, Dr. King had delivered a prophetic speech where he had channeled the story of Moses. And Dr. King said that he had been to the mountaintop and he had looked over and he had seen the promised land. And he told the crowd, I may not get there with you, but tonight I want you to know that we as a people will get to the promised land. The next morning, the next day, Dr. King was shot and killed. So as Richard Nixon takes the oath of office in January of 1969, the civil rights issue is still on the front of every American's mind. But Dr. King's no longer there to lead it. So going forward into 1969, things are going to remain quite tumultuous inside the United States of America. But our old buddy, Richard Nixon, who, again, done some decent things, is going to be at the head of the American executive branch of government. We will continue there in a future lecture. Hopefully in the next lecture we will talk about the 1969 moon landing, the stuff going on in Vietnam as well, and of course, Woodstock. Until next time, which will probably literally be within the next 10 minutes, have a good one.